Hey friend, Colin here from Sumthins Recording, and today I'm going to show you how to mix snare drum for more weight and better crack. I'm going to start by playing the drum inside the finished mix here. You can hear how it fits in context, and then I'll solo it up inside the drum mix, and of course, by itself as well. So here's our snare drum inside the finished mix.
Making space for those that are in our heart. 'Cause here now we know.
So you can hear our snare drum has a lot of good crack. It cuts through in the drum mix as well as the entire mix, and it's big, but it's not muddy. So we're getting the weight we want out of the drum without it getting too thick or getting too muddy. Let me take off all the processing here, and you can hear what we started with. So here's our raw snare drum recording, no plugins, and I'll kick the processing in. You can hear our before and after. You can hear our snare drum has a little bit of weight beforehand, before our processing, but it's kind of dull sounding. It doesn't have a lot of crack, and it certainly wouldn't cut through in the mix. So let's take everything off here, and let me show you what we're doing. The first plugin that I'm usually putting on my snare drum and my kick drum is a limiter. If it doesn't need it, it doesn't need it, but this is always there to start in case I need to pull it in. And I'm usually just doing about 3 dB of reduction, This is just a little bit of safety, and it helps make sure that every plugin after this in my chain isn't having to do too much work, and that it's getting a more even signal. So if I can do just a little bit of reduction on some of the bigger peaks and just grab any giant spikes on the snare drum here, then I'm feeding an already evened out signal into my EQ. So as I boost stuff, it's not grabbing any huge peaks and pulling them up as they jump out here. So I'm gonna hit play. I've got the ceiling all the way down here at -12, not pushing anything on the threshold, just trying to grab a little bit on these bigger peaks. So you can see on some of these hits, it's not doing much at all, but some like this guy in the middle here, where it really jumps up and he happens to strike it way harder than everything else, we're getting about 5 dB reduction there. So it's just grabbing that one peak, pulling it down so we have a more even signal to go into our first EQ. Here's our first EQ. The only thing I'm doing on this to start, I'm gonna turn these guys off here. The first thing I'm doing here is pulling in a high pass filter. I wanna try and weed out some of the kick bleed if possible. So if I do compress and I do boost bottom end, we're not bringing up a lot of kick bleed here, and I wanna make sure we control the bottom end so things don't get too thick and they don't get too muddy. So I've got a high pass in here, 12 dB per octave at 138 hertz, just tightening up our bottom end, trying to focus it more around the fundamental, around 150, 200 hertz. So I'm gonna hit play, and then I'll kick the high pass in. You can hear it cleans up some of the kick bleed there. It also softens that transient around the fundamental area, that 150, 200 area, so it's not so bottom heavy at this point. Now, before I do top end boosts, I like to pull in a compressor. So we've controlled our bottom end here. That means we can boost it later. So don't worry about the bottom end that we cut there. We're not going to thin out our snare drum too much here. We're going to make sure it's nice and weighty in our track here. But I want to compress it next. Before I do any kind of boosting, I want to get the snare drum even, and I want to be able to sit it inside the track. So I've got my compressor here, about a 20 millisecond attack, 21.9 milliseconds. We're making sure there's enough room on the front end there that the transient can pop through and that we're not squashing the transient, but it's a little bit faster than, say, 30, 40 milliseconds because our snare drum has a faster transient. You can see it's a sharper spike here on our kick drum, especially some of these bigger ones. So I do want to pull those down and control them, but I don't want to cut off our initial transient. Release is a little faster because we have some of these bigger rolls, and I don't want to hold on to the snare drum and over compress something that follows one of our bigger spikes. So a 60 millisecond release there, about a 21 millisecond attack, 3-to-1 ratio, so nothing too aggressive here, but we're making sure we can control our peaks. We're going to be doing about 6, maybe 7 dB of reduction here on some of these bigger peaks. So take a listen here without, and then I'll kick it in. Pay attention to how our front end transient changes and how we shape our snare drum with the compressor. So it greatly evens out the volume of our snare drum, but it also helps to emphasize that front end attack a little bit and push it out. So we have this front end attack that when we boost top end now, we can really bring out the crack on the snare drum there. And that's because we're leaving space with the attack on our compressor to let that front end transient pop through there. About 7 dB reduction, controlling the volume on our snare drum. Now, we've got our compressor in place. I'm going to go back pre-compression, and I'm going to boost top end into it. The first thing I want to boost is I just want to add a little bit of air. This is just going to give us some top end brightness on the snare drum. And then this is where we're going to get our crack here. I'm going to add a little bit here at, well, not a little bit, right? Almost 9 dB at almost 2K. So 1.82K, I'm adding a ton of mid-range here. You'll see when I hit play, there's kind of this dip going on in the mid-range. And we need that on our snare drum to get that crack and to get it to cut through. So I'm going to hit play, and then I'm going to kick these two boosts in. So a little bit of air up top, almost 5 dB at 9K, and then a whopping 9 dB, 8.5 dB at about 2K here. You can hear what a difference this boost at about 2K makes on our snare drum. It really wakes up the drum overall and gives it all of the crack and cut it needs to compete inside this track. The mid-range is very, very important on our snare drum. So that's our first EQ. Now what I want to do is I want to go post-compression. Here's where we want to add our weight. We're adding that crack, we're adding that cut, pre-compression, boosting that into the compressor, so our compressor is going to clamp down on that top end and even out our frequency range as well as our volume on our snare drum. That's how we're getting it to cut through, but our weight we want to add post-compression. We don't want to overdrive the compressor by boosting bottom end. We want to do it post-compression, so we even out our drum, and then we bring up this bottom end that's even, and that's going to be really, really big and nice on our snare drum. There's also a little cut going on here, 12 dB at about 700 hertz, but really, really narrow, just making sure there's no ringing frequencies going on. So take a listen to the shaping here. I'm going to hit play. We're adding only a dB and a half at 141 hertz here, but listen to how the bottom end changes on our snare drum. We're getting a ton of weight from this. really helps our snare drum feel big. So when we throw it in with our kick drum here, you can hear they sit competitively. One isn't taking dominance in our track. It's like they trade punches, right? You hear a kick drum strike, and then you hear our snare drum strike, and they feel even. They both feel big inside of our track here. I did throw a limiter on the end here just for a little bit of safety on some of those bigger peaks. I want to make sure the snare drum is controlled. I don't want any of these bigger peaks to pop out. We did a 9 dB boost in the mid-range there to add a ton of crack, but we got to control that crack. So we want our snare drum to cut through, but we don't want it to pop out really aggressively. So a limiter right at the end of the chain here. I know it seems like a lot of compression and limiting, but we're really keeping our snare drum in place here inside the track. So we can get it to cut and we can get it to be competitive, but it doesn't overtake our track here. So let's dump it back inside the mix here, see how our snare drum is sitting.
Making space for those that are in our 'cause here now we know, making space for those that are in our 'cause here now.
Getting more weight and better crack on our snare drum here. Let's review a little bit of limiting at the front of the chain to get a more even signal going into our EQs, going into our compression. So getting that evenness right from the get-go. First EQ, rolling off any excess bottom end coming from our kick drum, making sure we're focusing on the fundamental here. Compressor to even out the sound as well as the frequency range, emphasize some of that front end transient. We get more of that coming in from this mid-range boost here, adding a touch of high to bring out that air, help our snare drum cut through. And then at the very, very end of the chain here, we are doing, I'm moving things all around here, but at the very, very end of our chain, we're boosting our bottom end just about 1.5 dB to add that weight post-compression and to get that evenness in the bottom end on our snare drum. I hope that was helpful for you if you are looking to go a little bit deeper into the mixing process in its entirety and really start to hone your workflow as an audio engineer. Then I have just the tool for you, and it is completely free. It is my 7-step mixing checklist, and it's just a simple PDF that will walk you through the entire mixing process step by step to help you get professional and radio-ready mixes without any more of the hassle and without any more of the guesswork. Completely free to download, and you can get access to that by clicking the link below in the video description. Thank you so much for hanging with me here today, and I will see you in the next video.